Hi, everyone, and welcome to Behind the Numbers. My name is Dave Bookbinder. I am your host, and this is the program where we dig deeper to understand what really matters in business. If you're a business owner or an entrepreneur, wouldn't it be really cool to have somebody to give you some on-call decision support? Well, I've got somebody who does just that, and I'm pleased to welcome Jodi Hume to Behind the Numbers. Jodi, welcome to Behind the Numbers.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. Tell the audience a little bit about yourself and what on-call decision support means.
It's something I made up, but
Awesome.
not out of like it's not like I just made it up. It is something that evolved over 30 plus years of a career, and also goes all the way back to my childhood. Honestly, I am a third generation entrepreneur. My mom was an entrepreneur, and so entrepreneurial conversations, decisions, all the things that people who run businesses grapple with were the conversations that were happening around my dinner table and at Christmas and whatnot. So it's just a very familiar territory, like behind the scenes of what it really takes to actually grow a business. But then the super short version is I spent 15 years with an architecture firm as we grew from 1 to like 12 million. I was on the leadership team the entire time. And that was better than any MBA I could have possibly had. I was not an architect, but I started off in marketing and slowly just took over everything and became the COO. They just wanted to be architects, and I like to make things better. So we paired up very nicely, but we had weekly leadership team meetings every Monday, and I facilitated those. And that's where all of our conversations and all of our decisions were made. And so about 15 years ago, I left and started doing this solely, which is working. I started off doing some coaching. I've always done facilitation, and that slowly evolved away from coaching into what I call on-call decision support, which
Yep.
was really because that's what I felt like people need. Most entrepreneurs don't need a coach. They don't need a consultant. They don't need more ideas. They just need to hear themselves think and have somebody to bounce things off of for those last little bits of like clarity. And then they're off to the races.
Yeah, let's play with that just a little bit because I work with business owners and I've interviewed lots of business owners on this program. And many of them feel like they need to do it alone, right? That they can't show the weakness, that they've got to have all the answers. But there is so much value in some form of a sounding board for entrepreneurs. I'd like you to share your thoughts on that.
Yeah. So it's so interesting. Part of how this evolved was I was trying to do traditional coaching. I was following in the steps of people who had done both life and business coaching, which is another piece of this. Like, I do not believe that you can separate those two things. I think they're inextricable, and I will die on that hill every single time. And I had a real interest in both. So I was following in the footsteps of people who had done that. And over and over and over again, I would have people reach out to me through word of mouth referrals or seeing, marketing materials I had. And they would think they needed a coach. And they would talk something through, and I would have a couple questions, just trying to understand what was going on. And there'd be like one little thread we pull, and they're like, oh, and I could feel that they did not need a 6-month program or a year of working with me, or even the next 3 weeks. In that moment, they had what they needed. And like I said, they were off to the races. They were good on their own. And I would say, well, call me back if ever you need it. This, by the way, was a very daunting from a business model standpoint, because I was doing these like introductory calls, and then they just legitimately only had a momentary problem. There's a fine line here where sometimes, that can be just like playing whack-a-mole at symptoms. So you have to watch that a little bit. Sometimes there is something deeper that needs to change, or a bigger thing that needs to be worked on. So I'm always listening for that. But I just, over a couple of years of this, realized that most entrepreneurs don't have someone to talk to, for all the reasons that gets harder. And there are many reasons that gets harder and harder and harder. Most of the people that I end up working with are doing something with a heightened level of uncertainty. It's more unusual. It's just not off the beaten path. It's a little bit off the beaten path of like a normal, where someone else has done this 100 times ahead of them. So uncertainty is higher. And when you mix less people to talk to and higher uncertainty, and then triple that if you happen to be a verbal processor, which is a whole neuroscience piece of like verbal processors have to talk a thing through for their brain to like categorize and put everything where it needs to go. Not having that can be paralyzing or bog you down or make you spin your wheels. And I just realized that's what so many people need, is this like quick check-in of like, am I crazy? Is this right? Like, pretty sure I need to hire this person, or pretty sure I need to fire this person, but I just need that last little nudge of validation one way or the other. Because validation can be great job, or like, I think you're missing something here. And so I started figuring out what that would look like to offer to people.
And how do you find the entrepreneurs, we'll call it mindset around this? Because so many of them are, as I mentioned at the top here, resistant to the idea that they need help, or they're unwilling to, or perhaps they just don't even know that it's available to them in some instances. But
Such a
how do you crack that nut?
well, so one of the ways I crack that nut is not trying to crack that nut. There is a certain amount of sort of take the two ends. There are some people who just get it. And the minute that they know that that is something, I had a client sign on a few years ago, and was, it sounds so silly, but was like almost a little teary eyed, where he was like, I didn't even know this has existed. Like I've always wished I just had somebody that I could just call and check in. I didn't feel like I needed some big, hire a coach, like, cause he didn't need a coach. And so there are tons of people out there who already feel it. And the minute that they know it's a possibility, they're like, yes, please, I need that. So I mostly work with those people. If we flip to the other side for a second, if someone doesn't get it, they either just simply don't need it. Like my husband does not need anyone to talk. He's an internal processor. He's like, the way he's wired, he would never hire a me. And so those people either don't need it, or they don't understand that they would need it, and it's too much of a climb. But there are people in the middle who don't realize how valuable it is to have somebody. They don't realize what they're missing. And so for that part, to answer your question, I find ways to make it really easy. I mean, this is good business advice in general, make it easy for people to do what you want them to do, or to experience what you want them to experience. So I host more open things where people can just come for a very specific reason, which is more tangible and easier to get. And then as we talk it through, they can feel what it feels like to just be able to bounce something off of someone who isn't involved, who doesn't have a stake in the game that they're playing, who can be objective and who can get up to speed very quickly on what they're trying to figure out. And so that is the best marketing I could do for kind of that middle ground. But because it's tough to explain, you really just have to experience, and it's either for you or not for you, and either one of those is perfectly fine.
That's great. Thank you for sharing. One of the areas where I certainly see the business owners struggling at times is around the exit strategy, whether it's thinking about the exit, going through an exit process, enduring due diligence. And I know you're involved in all of those things with business owners. So
Yeah.
love for you to share your experiences and maybe any advice and guidance you have for folks out there listening around some diligence considerations for entrepreneurs.
Yeah. I often joke about like these multiple times that you go through like business puberty as you're growing as a company or growing as a leader. And there are always these times where um things are awkward, and like and it can feel like something's wrong with you, but the reality is that's just what happens as you're in that transition period. And so it's almost like business, like the exit part is I don't know, you almost want to akin to like leading up to death or menopause or something. I don't know. There's but actually I will take the menopause joke a little bit slightly further, because very similarly, not enough is talked about how different things are and how hard they can be, and those two things have a lot of similarities. So exits are very romanticized in the startup world, not so much in like other kinds of business that aren't on that startup churn of like having investors and leading to some big exit. Still a little bit, but not nearly as much as in the startup world. And in the startup world, they are very romanticized. It is perceived as like the thing you want to do as fast as possible and as big as possible. And we could spend the whole time talking about this. The things that happen during that period are so daunting that no matter how much I would tell a client I was working with during the regular part of their business, when anytime they would consider any kind of an equity event, I would say like, hey, I need you to understand, like, these are some things that are going to happen during that time. And we need to be thinking about that, planning for that. And they're like, oh yeah, I'll be fine. It's a little bit like kind of when you're a teenager is talking about how excited they are to be an adult. And you're like, I hear you. There's some great things about being an adult. And there's some things that are not fun about being an adult. And they're like, whatever, I'll get to make all my own decisions. I'm like, that's one of the things that's not so fun about being
Yeah.
an
Good luck with
adult.
that.
Yeah, good luck with that. Like but you can't really know until you're there. But I will share a couple of them. They might sink in a tiny bit. The physical and emotional and psychological and cognitive exhaustion of it cannot be underestimated. Like, if I try to describe it, it'll sound like I'm being hyperbolic. But in addition to the things I think people do think about, where you are essentially for that period of time running two businesses, almost three, because just the due diligence process on its own, all the data questions that come 30 questions at a time in emails 3 times a day, the additional generation of work that it requires for you and your team is huge. But you're also running two versions of your own business for that time. And if it's a really short time, which it usually isn't, that's not as big of a deal. But a lot of these things are stretched out 3, 6, 8, 9 months sometimes. And in that case, every decision that you have, many of them have two different paths. Like, one, if you end up selling, the other path if you don't. And so you're constantly trying to have like bifurcated decision processes. So that's really stressful. The other really stressful thing is that, like, who you can talk to about it. And this also varies whether you're selling to, like, who you're selling to. It gets really intense if you're selling to a publicly traded company, because then there are serious rules about what you can share. And not only does that diminish your ability to verbally process with the exact same people and not just verbally process, but collaborate and have like cohesive, smart, strategic conversations with people that you normally would. That's already one sort of chunk down. But there's also a very like emotional, psychological piece to it where, especially if you're a leader who has led with a lot of transparency and high trust, you can have people come to you and ask questions that at best you have to hide things from them that are going to absolutely affect that decision or them personally. And sometimes you have to outright lie to them. And it's I start to say it sounds like a small thing. It doesn't sound like a small thing, but it is the thing that I have seen almost wreck a CEO in that process, because that they have grown their entire identity as a leader of being this trustworthy, honest person. And to know that that person is going to look back in a month and be like, we had that conversation and you said this and you knew that this was happening and you didn't tell me. And even if they understand you can't, it's that hangs on people sometimes. It's just a thing you have to be prepared for. And last but not least, sort of the flip side to that, when more people can know, let's pretend for a second everyone can know. Something really weird happens to people's brains when you are in the middle of a potential merger or acquisition. It's like everyone falls down a couple levels in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where suddenly everything feels like a survival conversation. Like people will hear something and they're like, oh, does that mean I won't have a job? And you're like, we're not even talking about that. We're talking about something completely different. Everyone's on edge. People act less mature and nuanced thinking as they normally would. And so you'll end up with all these, it'll feel like everything's falling apart, but it's really just everyone having their own little version of their own emotional reaction to what this means to them. And people will take it wildly different ways, and super weird behavior shows up.
Yeah, you're speaking the truth. I've seen that several times in my career, going through mergers and acquisitions, and it's all about the uncertainty, right? People oftentimes, when there's uncertainty, expect the worst scenario. So sometimes they're thinking they're going to jump ship before the event because it can't be any good if it happens, right?
Yeah.
So it's the uncertainty component. Speaking of uncertainty, one of the big things I always hear that prevents business owners from actually exploring the sale is they don't know what they're going to do next. They don't have something on the horizon. That's overcomeable. And let's go with the let's pretend scenario that they've gone through the mental gymnastics and they've come to the conclusion that for whatever reason, it's now the right time to actually sell their business.
Hmm.
But because they're business owners and it's their baby, they can't really fully let go. And maybe they're looking for rollover equity, or maybe they'd like to have an earnout. Now, understand where the buyers enjoy that because they want the owners to stick around, and the earnout certainly a bridge to valuation discrepancies. But in the situation where a business owner is involved in those earnouts and rollovers, what's been your experience and what happens after the sale? From and tap into the neuroscience background.
Yeah, yeah, it is. I'm going to hit it with straight psychology first, which is it is really hard on most owners if you are like sticking with a scenario of where you are now employed by this new company that now owns your baby. And it's almost, I mean, if you haven't noticed, I always think in metaphor because when you can get it back to a more relatable thing, it's almost like you've taken your entire family or at least your kids and like moved into someone else's house, and now that person gets to decide what time you have dinner and what time your kids go to bed and whether or not they have to eat everything on their plate or whether you and what it's bumping up hard against, there's a couple different things. One, actually, it bumps up hard against everything. It bumps up against your values. Like when you are doing your own thing, you get to like shave and very like minutely curate what you want the culture to be of your firm. And that's not to say everyone does a great job of it, but whatever you did, you have made those decisions about what you change and what you don't change. Same goes for the product and your vision for it and where it goes and what happens to it. And now someone else gets to make all those decisions. And you don't always have the luxury of finding someone who's completely aligned on all those things. You also don't have the luxury of knowing whether or not they will be aligned, even if it felt like it beforehand, because once you've crossed that line, now it's theirs. And I've seen some really sad things. Um, and also some really great things. It's not, I don't mean to paint this like horrible picture all the time. I just realized I was like, I'm being very like down on this whole thing. There's great stuff about it. But I feel like the great stuff already has its own swim lane that is very well filled up. And so I do focus on these more negative things because I don't think they get talked about enough.
Yeah, and the
Um,
people want to protect themselves from the downside.
yes, yes. And so just a couple, and then I will get into the neuroscience of it, but um, like shorter, I think there's a lot of things you can be hopeful about, but you have to have a certain amount of detachment about like where you imagine your product will go, what will happen to every single team member and where they go and if they are happy and whatnot. um, Also those earnouts, like they're very, I would not be, if you're banking on them, I would be very, very cautious because you are sometimes not in control of the things that will check those boxes or not. And it can be very, very upsetting. And here's the thing. It's not like when I am having these conversations with people, it's not about um, trying to not be upset. Like there's no version of this where you're not going to be uncomfortable or discontent. What I'm listening for is to avoid like life regrets. You know, you have built this thing that you're really proud of. You've sold it. On the other side of that, I just want to minimize the things that people are like, sad trombone sound about in a way that feels like a regret that also colors, it makes the whole thing they did feel like it was a waste or somehow it ends up, it can color the entire thing way before the merger. So it's just listening for those. And that is the questions I will ask someone going into this process. Like, they'll list all the things they care about. I'm like, what's the one thing you care about? Or what are the two things you care about most? Fight to protect those in these negotiations and know your willingness to let these other things go. I think of it literally like a stereo equalizer. It's like, well, I want all my employees to have a place. I'm like, what kind of place? What does it mean for that? Like, do you care most about having all of them have a place, or do you care most about some of them having like a really good place? Or I make them get really detailed so that, not because you can predict the future, but so that you have a litmus test that in those moments of these crazy negotiations, you can say like, I care about this most. And that matters because your question is about what happens on the other side. And the more you have done to make sure that what you get out of the negotiation scratches your personal itches. I'm not talking about what you get out of the negotiating is the most dollars, because that is not always what is most satisfying to people. It's often a lot of other things that they may or may not notice. And so doing that work to know what will make being on the other side of that line harder for you so that you can fight for it or decide you can't do it because that will just feel too awful. Because no amount of money is worth having like a complete life regret about 10 or 15 years of your life or something. So,
Yeah.
so those, be careful about the earnouts, be really realistic about how long you think you can live as a caged animal inside that other company. A lot of entrepreneurs are pretty feral by the time they sell. And I know, like, 5 years might not sound like a long time. I've never seen anyone last 5 years. Like 1 year, sure. 2 years starts to get hard. 3 years, they're usually calling me to like, how can I, like, I'm going crazy.
Yeah.
I don't know him personally, but there's someone I know in our business community who sold and committed to a 10-year thing, which
Wow.
I've never seen that, and I will never understand that. But be cautious about that.
Yeah, and a couple of things I just want to put an exclamation mark on there to your point about the time commitment. Yeah, definitely think that through. And prudent economic advice: don't bank on the earnout or the rollover materializing. That second bite of the apple doesn't always happen. Um,
This may not be wholly accurate from an M&A standpoint, but I just think it's good to like test this. In the same way people say, like, don't lend money that you aren't okay with never getting back. If the only way you're okay with this deal is if you get all those earnouts and second bites, like, you're going to have like rethink it, with the caveat, of course, of sometimes these whole processes are happening not because you're just, sometimes they just need to happen, whether it's
yeah,
financially or energetically. And so obviously, or maybe not obviously, it's why I'm taking the time to say it. We're talking about the ideal. Like sometimes if you're sort of more on the fire sale side of things, you can't maximize every variable, but I would argue all the more reason to know which things you want to maximize. It might only just be one thing you have a chance to maximize, and you have to let go of 35 other things that it's going to hurt, but not as much as letting go or even dampening on that one. That's why the nuance of it is so important.
yeah. I want to take the conversation up another 10,000 feet, kind of broaden it out a little bit, if you don't mind. I would love to get your take on any of the themes that you're seeing that entrepreneurs may be experiencing, challenges, issues, difficulties.
Yeah. Yeah. I am. So going into this year, like towards the end of last year, because I want to, feels like there's two segments here. Towards the end of 2024, I was just seeing a lot of, I don't want to, it's a little bit not right to say tired. Um, Energy was low in a way that didn't just feel like I've pushed really hard. I mean, the last couple of years, especially for startups, have been dry. These are not the years of like a ton of money coming in and everything being super easy. It's been a rough couple of years. And those couple of years are coming right off of COVID, which was massive uncertainty and anxiety and unknowns. And I think as a collective, and this isn't just about startups, our stores of resilience have, like, whatever you rely on for resilience, which is different for everyone, have been depleted. And I feel like most people are fine most of the time. But whereas before, you might have to dig like a few inches or feet or even miles to get to the sort of petulant or like just not as put together or, less patient part of them, whatever your version of that is. Now what I'm seeing is a kind of tiredness that shows up in two ways. One, like the tiniest little scratch gets like a bleeder and also shows up in a lack of interest. Like I've gotten a lot of calls towards the end of last year saying like, do I hang it up? Is this the time? I always say like, is this the time for business hospice? Like, and I welcome that conversation anytime and as frequently as needed, because it's rarely about needing to pack it up. It's usually a symptom of some other unmet need that we need to identify what's going on. Or sometimes it's not always a personal thing. Sometimes it's like being tired, which goes back to the neuroscience. Sometimes it's that the company needs to shift in some way. It's exhausting because it's hard because something needs to pivot a little bit. So really getting, that's why I call my company At the Core. What we're doing is getting down to what is at the core of this issue, because I don't want you to waste time and energy on a bunch of surface level stuff. Let's figure out what thread we need to pull to fix this. So I was getting a lot more of that towards the end of last year than I normally have. Now, and let's keep in mind, that didn't change dramatically over the holiday season. So we're going into this new thing already depleted. And with the just gestures broadly uncertainty that is happening everywhere right now, especially in our country, there's so many questions that people aren't even sure what problem to think about or which things to solidify, and there's just so many unknowns. And I know this sounds like a little bit like Pollyanna-ish, but there is something oddly good or reassuring about not knowing, not being able to know with a capital K anything, which is I can't know anything. So in a weird way, it reminds me of this meme I saw where there's this monk standing on a rock with this like completely still water, and it says, "Relax, nothing is nothing is under control." Something like
So
that.
true.
And it is this like, if there's nothing that you can do to create certainty, then there is some peace to be had in knowing that you need to lean on your adaptability skills and your scrappy resourcefulness and your ability to know. So it does sort of change the question to, what do I and my team and my company need to be doing to be at our best, to be scrappy, resourceful, and adaptable and have what we need? Like, do I need to, I mean, this may or may not be a little late, but like, this is when those questions, like if you haven't already thought about things like making sure you have a line of credit or making sure you've, whatever makes sense in your business. I don't even want to give examples because it's so different in every business, but it might look like, let's all get really rested. Let's all make sure that we're not burning the midnight oil unless it's absolutely necessary, that we are taking good care of our bodies and our brains and our hearts. And that's why I do this little giveaway book that I made is based off of the 7 kinds of rest, which entrepreneurs aren't great at resting. So I think of it as recharge, not rest. So at least they'll listen a little bit. But I also have them think of it as avoiding fatigue, because that they'll start to listen to a little bit more. But the array of different kinds of recharging is really valuable, because most of the time it's not physical rest you need. It's social rest, making sure you're around those people who give you like juicy energy and don't drain it, and limiting time with people who, just you walk away and you're like, whoa, like this is the time to be pretty, I won't say mercenary, but not be shy about making sure you get the creative rest you need. Like I've recently found this very silly drawing app that for whatever reason, it just softens all my muscles, and I like disconnect and my brain recharges, and then my creativity comes back. So I've been making time for that every single day so that I can have that recharge. And there's a shamelessness to this process that I'm talking about, where I don't care if it's video games or finger painting or walking in the forest. If it recharges you, you should prioritize it in times of uncertainty.
Yeah, and I'm not hearing you say continue to scroll your news feed on social media to recharge yourself.
This is really hard. This is a really hard thing, I think, for entrepreneurs especially, because part of how we be good entrepreneurs is this duality of scanning the horizon and then looking at your feet about what to do, and like scanning, like everything has a duality. I have to look long term and I have to look short term. I have to look broad and I have to look really narrow. I have to like think about risks, and I have to like, notice what's working. And all of those things, we are wired to see the gaps. Like we are wired to see what isn't working. And that has a lot of value. But our brains, from an evolutionary standpoint, process negative things with 5 times the intensity as they do positive things. And that's a problem, because our brain needs to know what's working so that we can do more of it. And this is going to sound like a weird right turn to take, but it might be the most important thing right now. And that has to do with hope, which sounds like this is the right turn I'm taking for a second. But if I didn't tell, that's what I was just debating. I'm like, do I tell him it's hope or do I tell him the construct first? If I didn't tell you this had to do with hope, you would think that I had pulled it from a how to entrepreneur something, because hope is not wishing. It's not an emotion. It's not a feeling. It is a 4-part mental construct that is the basis for everything else. So when people are suicidal or when they are in their darkest places, they often work with them on these constructs, almost like ladders, rungs of a ladder to get back. Because if you don't have hope, nothing else fires and works. And so, but listen to these 4 things. So the first thing is goals. Can you see anything better for yourself? And in this case, your company, because this is what we're talking about. Like, can you see the destination that you're punching into Waze? The second thing, because if you can't, you got to start there. So there's goals, and then there's pathways, your ability to see different ways to get to the thing. And I think I actually just switched 2 and 3. I think the next one comes second, but it doesn't matter right now. Pathways is the ability to see like how you get to that destination. The third one is agency. So this is a belief, and I do believe it's actually second. The belief that you can affect the world enough to go on that pathway and create change or make things happen. And then the fourth one is the cognitive flexibility to reassess and re-navigate and figure a way around. And so when I have people look at that and say, like, where are you feeling wobbly? And it is, agency is the second one. Often this ties back to the newsfeed thing. It's that their hope or their belief that they have agency in what's going on in their world is very wobbly with people. And the problem is that absolutely, from a neuroscience standpoint, gets in your way of seeing the pathway and absolutely in the way of the cognitive flexibility you need to navigate if you don't actually, in some fundamental way, believe that you have that agency is something you have. So that's the place to work, which often means like finding ways to boost your sense of agency. And sometimes those are smaller things that we focus on than before. But yeah, the doom scrolling is eroding that sense of hopefulness at many different layers, at like all the layers. And if that goes, we are cooked. Like whether we're talking at a meta level or at a company level or at a human level, if you let that dissipate, it's going to be hard, or harder than it needs to be.
Yeah. And on that note, unfortunately we have to wrap. I could talk to you for another half hour here, but we're out of time. But before we say goodbye, do tell the audience how they can find you, how they can learn more about you, and tell us about the book and where we can get it.
Yeah, so it's a little ebook, but it's you can find all of that stuff, including that free download at thecore.com/gift, GIFT. So it's at thecore.com/gift. And there's a couple different things there. There's that book. I think there's another. I constantly add stuff. There's also some. You can get like 50% off individual sessions and whatnot. And if you're not sure if those work with you, I also have a link there to just book a connection call. That's just the curiosity of like, is this a person I would jive with? It's so important that I make all the time I can to just connect. And you almost back to your question of like, how do you convince people? I am such a believer in fit and trusting fit. It either makes sense or it doesn't. You will never get a hard sell from me, ever. It's just, would this seem like it'd be helpful? Great. If not, also great.
And I'm pretty sure they're going to have a great conversation with you based on my experience. So thank you so much for joining us today, Jodi. It's been great having you on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks. And thank you out there for supporting the program. Really, truly appreciate it. We can't do this program without your continued support. I want to shout out Frank in Missouri for his continued love and support of the program. And big thanks to the folks in Iowa. Got a big spike in at the great state of Iowa for listenership. So thank you out there. Shoot me a note. Let me know what kind of topics you'd like to hear on Behind the Numbers going forward. Again, my name is Dave Bookbinder. Hit me up on LinkedIn. If you're a business owner and you don't know what your business is worth, we should probably chat. So again, hit me up on LinkedIn. I help companies in getting their businesses valued for a whole boatload of reasons. That's all we have for today, gang. We'll see you next time on Behind the Numbers. Take care.